But in comparison, looking at all these 1993 subjects now incarcerated in contrast to the 9/11 conspiracy are more interesting, simply being that on the official scale, most of the criminal conspirators are alive, whereas for 9/11, the accounted ones are dead. And when comparing who's incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba that's said to be linked to 9/11, already clouded in controversy and saturated with mixed emotions, only helps to overshadow 1993, when for deeper truth seekers, there is less of an uphill battle getting access to answers as the bombing conspirators and other so-called Al-Qaeda members are all mainly housed at the ADX Supermax prison in Colorado, where not only Ramzi Yousef and the East Africa Embassy bombing conspirators are being held, so is the alleged 20th 9/11 hijacker, Zacarias Moussaoui.
We've learned that Reed, seen here in his cell, is in a special wing for terrorists called H Unit. Others include Zacarias Moussaoui, who wanted to be one of the 9/11 hijackers, and Wadi El-Hage, Osama bin Laden's former private secretary. We're told that there have been frequent hunger strikes among the Islamic terrorist inmates inside Supermax, and to keep the inmates alive, there are often force feedings. That's when an inmate is restrained and liquid nourishment is poured down a tube in his nose. We're told that there have been a dozen hunger strikers, and one of them used to be Osama bin Laden's secretary.
Not only was El-Hage bin Laden's secretary and an East Africa Embassy bombing conspirator, he's another Lebanese Al-Qaeda militant like the supposed Flight 93 hijacker Ziad Jarrah of the Hamburg cell, who also originally came from a Lebanese Christian family. Other than his activities prior in the Mid-Southwest pertaining to Afghan Services Bureau, what makes El-Hage more significant out of any of the 1993 or 9/11 conspirators is that he outnumbers them many years ahead, becoming a U.S. resident going as far back as 1978. But interestingly, El-Hage met with two other Al-Qaeda operatives from Germany in the island of Cyprus to conduct a transaction in purchasing this ship for Osama bin Laden in 1994. One of the operatives was Sadiq Walid Awad, who also had calls traced to Kenya from where he lived in Hamburg in 1997. Less is known about Awad, but El-Hage identified him as an Iraqi Al-Qaeda operative with German and Israeli passports. How does an Al-Qaeda operative get an Israeli passport? But unlike Awad, where no public photo exists of him, mainly the other individual involved in the transaction who met with El-Hage is the Syrian Mamoun Darkanazali, who is a founding member of the Hamburg cell and was arrested in Germany 2004 on a Spanish warrant but freed in 2005 by a ruling from the German Federal Constitutional Court. Darkanazali is under sanction as an affiliate or supporter of Al-Qaeda by the UN, the European Union, and the U.S. Treasury as a specially designated global terrorist. His company, Darkanazali Export-Import Sonderposten, in Hamburg, as until recent, is still listed there. He walks as a free man in Germany and has been under constant surveillance by the authorities there. Although for different ethnicities with the three 9/11 hijackers and Yemeni Ramzi bin al-Shibh, ultimately the rest of 9/11 is mainly looked upon as a crime committed by Saudis because of bin Laden's and the bulk of the hijacker nationalities. But for the rest of the Hamburg cell members, they were all mainly of Moroccan descent, and they are subjects that should not be overlooked. But they don't necessarily have any previous activity that is really revealing as far as going back into the early 90s, like the Syrian Darkanazali. But there's another Syrian who is also considered a Hamburg cell founder and has been labeled as Mohammed Atta's recruiter, Mohammed Haidar Zamar. Zamar was arrested in October of 2001 in Morocco, and instead of being deported to the US or Germany, he was secretly sent to Syria for indefinite detention. It was confirmed in 2005 that federal officers of the German Bundeskriminalamt, the BKA, had at least on one occasion interrogated Zamar in Syria under secrecy and unknown conditions. Zamar was then released as part of a prisoner exchange between the Islamist Syrian rebel group Ahrar al-Sham and the Syrian government in September of 2013. He was seen a year later in a home video behind an ISIS flag listening to a speech by the number 2 in the Islamic State in Aleppo, Syria. He was recaptured by members of the Kurdish People's Protection Units in March 2018 near Deir al-Zar, eastern Syria. He is currently being held in a prison in Qamishli, northern Syria, from where he's given interviews to the Washington Post and Der Spiegel in 2018. The status of these Syrian entries from Germany going as far back as the early 90s, deemed by some to be considered Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, should give an idea as to why they have gotten some sort of clearance by Allied Western intelligence, when we know throughout the Obama administration they are able to continue funding and aiding Al-Qaeda, spawning ISIS further, still after 9/11, but in attempts to topple Syria and take down Bashar al-Assad. But this early 90s time frame with Dr. Nazali, El-Hage, and Awad in Cyprus and Germany is interesting, being that it's the same time frame Mohammed Atta has already moved there. Plus, according to a New York Times article March 12, 1993, it says two of the suspects involved in the World Trade Center bombing, Mohammed Salameh and Nadel Ayad, had a joint account with a German bank where they were receiving periodic wired money transfers ranging in the thousands. And being that Mahmoud Abu Halima was already being a fundamentalist when he lived in West Germany, contrary to the official narrative of being radicalized by the blind sheikh years later, does seem conceivable that there could have been a stronger command structure having come out of Germany and with the goal of striking the Twin Towers than what the defined premise for it is as Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia. But continuing back in the U.S. and with other guilty associates at Supermax prison,
another terrorist in Supermax is Ramzi Yousef, the leader of the first World Trade Center attack in 1993. What did you make of him?
The most interesting inmate in my career. I was surprised that he was extremely respectful, prayed almost on the hour.
Yousef has been living in ADX for 11 years, sacrificing to live by his own code.
Something as simple as recreating. He would have to be strip searched to go recreate. He chose not to do that because of his belief that it'd be inappropriate for us to show his body or see his body.
And so he stays in the cell.
Never been out, to my knowledge.
As strict as that seems, we're told that there is an even higher level of confinement, sort of an ultramax inside Supermax. It's a group of cells where there is virtually no human contact, not even with the guards, and there are only 2 prisoners who are considered so dangerous that they're locked in this place that's known as Range 13. One of them is World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Yousef. Warden Hood says Yousef is on Range 13 for just one reason.
He has a Charlie Manson look.
Charlie Manson look?
He just has the eyes. He has some charisma about him. He's in uniform, but you know that there's a powerful person that you're looking at.
You didn't want him in a place where he could give anybody any orders.
True.
We're told something strange is happening with Yousef. He now insists that he has renounced Islam and converted to Christianity. He's even begun leaving his cell for exercise. Warden Hood left before all this happened, but still, he doesn't buy it.
He's playing a game with someone. If he's doing that, he's doing it for the reaction. He's doing it for whatever. He is the real deal.
There have been some new developments at Supermax. There have been more hunger strikes and force feedings, and both Tommy Silverstein and Ramzi Yousef have been moved to new cells, which leaves Range 13 empty, at least for now.
And there have been quite a few other developments since that 60 Minutes piece in 2007. Yousef has also put out a hit on Zacarias Moussaoui. According to letters Moussaoui wrote requesting transfer to Gitmo because he had been assaulted and harassed by other inmates and guards, including Ramzi Yousef, who has threatened to kill him. But obviously everybody who's gotten close enough to Yousef that we've demonstrated so far seems to certify that he does not fit the fanatical Muslim persona, even if he adapted to it sooner after incarceration. He's consistently deceiving people and he resonates as being a sociopath. And we can't simply ignore what a whistleblower like former National Security Advisor to the Bush administration, Richard Clarke, as what he said in regards to the unlikely coincidence of Terry Nichols being in the Philippines the same time Ramzi Yousef was.
We know that Terry Nichols and Ramzi Yousef, both people were in the same city at the same time. That's odd. Both people were interested in making bombs. Both people opposed the American government. Is it conceivable that in a mid-sized Philippine city, that 2 people who were interested in making bombs and hated the American government could have found each other somehow? I think it's conceivable.
What we've seen so far tells us the major significance ADX Supermax has over Gitmo. But how unsettling does this coincidence sound when Terry Nichols is incarcerated along with Yousef at ADX? Unsettling enough that even former California Congressman Dana Rohrabacher actually went to meet Nichols and held a press conference about his obstructions to interview Ramzi Yousef.
I have been denied for a year and a half now the right to speak to a federal prisoner, namely Ramzi Yousef. He's one of the top terrorists of the world, and he's been in prison for 10 years. He was responsible for the first World Trade Center bombing and is deeply, deeply involved with the creation of Al-Qaeda. What's more important to me at this moment is that Ramzi Yousef may have had a connection to the Oklahoma City bombing, and if that's true, the American people need to know about that. And there are other questions that need to be posed to Ramzi Yousef. He's a federal prisoner, and the United States Congress, especially those of us in investigative subcommittees, have a right to question federal prisoners. This is not someone who was just arrested yesterday, where there's some ongoing investigation that deals with this person. He's been in jail for 10 years. What we have is a denial of the right of Congress in order to set a precedent that we do not have the right to interview federal prisoners. The official reason that I have been denied the right to speak to Ramzi Yousef is that there is a, quote, ongoing investigation. And of course, I have been told by many people who work for the Justice Department and the White House that that is a standard phrase that is used to dismiss congressional inquiries without any substance to the dismissal, meaning this is made up. The person who said that it is an ongoing investigation to me simply said that as a phrase to dismiss a member of Congress and to dismiss Congress's right to participate in a particular activity, like interviewing this particular federal prisoner.
But aside the 8.5-year interval between 9/11 and the 93 bombing, with Oklahoma City bombing being right in the middle, it's a shame that with these three unresolved and sensitive events, which have become major social impacts on everyday life, seem overwhelmingly connected and in unusual contrary circumstances, are not seriously being dealt with by a realistic activist movement or archetypal organization pursuing real truth and accountability for who or what is ultimately at fault, even if becoming disillusioned by discovering vulnerabilities and weaknesses within the establishment that have played a role in judicial obstructions or cover-ups. But there is much more documentation regarded as circumstantial evidence about Terry Nichols, already married to a Philippine mail-order wife, that he, by himself, frequented the Philippines at the same time Ramzi Yousef and company were present, and that it could link to the Oklahoma City bombing as Al-Qaeda onto 9/11 and consequently after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. And there are still unanswered questions regarding Ramzi Yousef and his extended families past and present that we don't have enough time to cover their whereabouts, even though we've covered quite a bit of controversial links from him and his family of greater infamy. But separate from the many unanswered questions around Timothy McVeigh and the OKC bombing, a scenario of Ramzi Yousef and Terry Nichols crossing paths and networking is highly unlikely to most Americans. But when considering the 2 years of terrorist activities Yousef carried out as a fugitive after the 93 bombing throughout the Philippines, Thailand, Iran, and Pakistan, as with being contracted to assassinate Benazir Bhutto in 1994, only 2 assassinations have been attributed to the so-called Al-Qaeda organization. Ahmed Shah Massoud, the leader of the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, 2 days before 9/11, and then tragically with Benazir Bhutto in 2007. Not even Nasir-killing Kahana is counted. So if you still think Yousef's terrorist aspirations are exclusive to the Islamic mindset, when considering this crossed path with Terry Nichols, viewers can also read up on what Peter Lance also uncovered in 2013 with a sting set up on Yousef after his arrest while incarcerated in New York by the feds along with inmate and son of infamous mafia hitman for the Colombo crime family, Gregory Scarpa Jr., that was carried out by him as an informant jailed with Yousef in 1996. From that revelation with the discussion carried out between the two, you might want to envision Yousef having been a contract terrorist instead. And besides for 1995 being framed as a white militia conspiracy, Oklahoma in the Midwest with Texas is a central hub noted for Middle Eastern terrorists ahead of 9/11, as a couple of hijackers stayed in Oklahoma City before momentarily. Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, and Nawaf al-Hazmi. Plus Zacharias Moussaoui had actually lived there, attending flight school in Norman, Oklahoma. But the presence there in Oklahoma is still prevalent in the past by the same apparatus before in the late 80s, with Wadi El-Hage, who was living in Texas at the time, met with Mahmoud Abu Halima at an Islamic conference in Oklahoma, where it is said that Abu Halima told El-Hage to buy a .38 caliber revolver for him, and that it was the same one that Nasser used to kill Meir Kahana. And Oklahoma seems to be more like the crossroads or central point, because also take notice of who resides in Texas. Like Yousef's close friend, Abdul Hakim Murad. Not only did he receive pilot training more than any 9/11 hijacker, He had also trained in San Antonio and is completely in the middle of the Bojinka plot, where then, after the Oklahoma City bombing, he admitted verbally April 19, 1995, and in writing, that Ramzi Yousef's Liberation Army was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing. Liberation Army is the same title Nadal Ayad had left as a phone-recorded message taking blame for the 93 bombing. And then there's Husseini al-Hussein, the supposed Iraqi that's the focus in Jana Davis's book, The Third Terrorist. Regardless of her marginalizing other competing theories about the Oklahoma City bombing, her pursuit on al-Hussein and all those linked was just. And even if her findings and conclusions are embraced by neocon opportunists and their attempts for Iraq war pretext, the consequences of legal actions taken against Davis in writing her book by the power of al-Hussein's legal defense team should be questioned, especially when it was later revealed that al-Hussein was working at Logan Airport, where hijacked flights 11 and 175, both planes they hit the World Trade Center, departed from, during the period of the September 11th attacks, and was even questioned by authorities after. But even after the Oklahoma City bombing, and before moving to the Boston area, Husseini al-Hussein also moved to Irving, Texas, where he had been arrested for a DUI there. Aside from the glaring coincidence of Ryder moving vehicles, isn't it interesting how Imad Salem detailed how the bomb making for the Landmark plot and the bomb used in Oklahoma City 1995 were similar, being ammonium nitrate fertilizer bombs as used in the World Trade Center? But isn't it also interesting when between that time frame, in 1994, while no kind of terrorist attack occurred in the US, the same type of ammonium nitrate bomb was used at the AMIA, that's the Argentine Israelite Mutual Association building in Buenos Aires. The incident was carried out by a suicide bomber in a van, in which killed 85 people and injured over 300. Yet how come Iran and Hezbollah was first blamed for the AMIA bombing? And a better question, why is Hezbollah constantly and falsely accused for other terrorist attacks elsewhere? Why is it said that Hezbollah was founded with the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Lebanon under the planning of Imad Mughniya, which Hezbollah has denied, and a group called Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility? And what does it say when it was also revealed from Viktor Ostrowski's by way of deception the making and unmaking of a Mossad officer being met with pressure not to be released, in which it details the Mossad's foreknowledge of the Marine barracks bombing but did not alert US officials, where 241 military service personnel ended up being killed? In fact, why do most Americans not recognize the Marine barracks bombing as the largest terrorist attack on Americans before 9/11? Separate from the embassy attacks or incidents carried out on US soil, is there a common social disconnect amongst the American consensus that rejects innocent military servicemen and women who are victims of terrorist attacks not to equate them the same as civilian casualties? Could that also be why such events like the attack on the USS Liberty aren't well received to the public, just as the Pentagon attack with Flight 77 on 9/11 isn't well received by conspiracy theorists and truth activists? Why did Ali Mohammed in 1984, after offering his services to the CIA in Cairo, was he also stationed in Hamburg and assigned to infiltrate mosques associated to Hezbollah? Why after 9/11 did the Bush administration offer a $5 million reward leading to the arrest of Hezbollah members in the 1985 hijacking of TWA 847, especially when one of them was already in US custody since 1987, captured member Fawaz Yunus? But yet, 7 years later after 9/11, one of the main hijackers and leaders, Hezbollah founder Imad Mughniya, who was able to hide for decades after, even gone under plastic surgery to change his identity, ends up getting assassinated in Syria by the Mossad in 2008 with the help of their infiltrating spy, Ali Jarrar, 9/11 hijacker Ziad Jarrar's cousin? And looking back at these two Lebanese, Jarrar and El-Hage, both originally coming from Arab Christian backgrounds and having both stayed in Germany, the US, and elsewhere, is part of the Mossad's playbook specifically using Lebanese assets so that it's easier to set them up as a pretext to frame Hezbollah? And with Palestinians, what about Mossad asset Ahmed El-Hage? How do we know for certain that he may have been a Palestinian Christian when he was involved in the 93 bombing? He's only shown to have been strictly practicing Islam in recent time, as he has started suing the prison for failing to accommodate to his religious beliefs.
All right, the terrorist convicted in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing is now suing the United States.
He says his religious rights are being violated in prison because his meals aren't catered to his Islamic beliefs.
And there's still more to find out. But as even PBS Frontline themselves highlighted, that without El-Hage and the items that he carried when arriving at JFK with Ramzi Yousef in 1992, there would be no premise to label such a loose network as Al-Qaeda, as demonstrated on their special about the late head of the FBI Terrorism Task Force, John O'Neill. But why in the late 80s, after El-Hage is released from an Israeli prison and turned into a Mossad asset, was he assigned to Al-Fatah a group known to receive weapons, explosives, and trainings from the Soviet Union, but then somehow unnoticeably, he was able to join Hamas in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets. And like Iyad Ishmael living in Dallas, who suddenly appears after in the 93 bombing conspiracy, El-Hage had already previously lived in Texas working as a pizza deliverer in San Antonio before entering the US again in 1992. Essentially, El-Hage could be considered the bombing mastermind of 1993, being that he was also in a prime position while detained to make orders, since Yousef wasn't able to entirely set up the bomb without El-Hage's manuals and experience, and from the bombing attempts that we have charted from Yousef, most of them were unsuccessful. El-Hage has since been transferred to Supermax Terre Haute prison in Indiana in 2018, and he, like many of these conspirators, are serving life sentences and are unapproachable for questions and interviews, which again tells you many answers could be found on US shores rather than further obstructions through Gitmo, Cuba. But lastly and luckily, that's not the situation when it comes to Pakistani Wali Khan Amin Shah as far as getting some sort of answers, as he's also in Terre Haute and was right in the middle of the Bojinka planning. But since he's been cooperative with US authorities, he's set to be free 2 years from now in March of 2022. Perhaps we may get answers as to who else was behind these 90s terrorist attacks and 9/11, and how they really functioned. But if these so-called top Al-Qaeda masterminds and their leaders aren't born and raised fundamentalist Muslims, just like the case with Osama bin Laden ironically, who in his early college years liked to live it up as a partying bachelor, shouldn't this all in the long run be called Arab terrorism? And isn't it also interesting, as reported by Terry McDermott on June 24, 2002, in the LA Times, while KSM was still wanted, that members of his cell, including a girlfriend, had a drinking party to celebrate the anniversary of the 1988 Pan Am Flight 103 explosion over Lockerbie, Scotland, an incident officially blamed on Gaddafi and Libyan pilots, and not anything remotely to do with Al-Qaeda? Throughout this film, we've covered a lengthy time span in the 1990s, and it's vital to helping understand what the problems really are, and what ones will continue to lay ahead. And separate from the focus of physical cover-ups that the truth movement seems only obsessed with, these crimes are still connected, even systemically, and it shows how the branch-out effect of operatives between 9/11 and 1993 is real. That's why it's important to understand, or to have a basic grasp, not just about the atrocities of terrorist incidents committed or the pretexts being used or attempted, but the historical efforts of prevention by Anti-Terrorism Task Force, even if such focus seems to emphasize the bottom end of a great conspiracy. Most 9/11 truthers are oblivious to official narratives of these crimes, just as much as they are being indoctrinated in a cult conspiracy worldview, that they'll even deny or doubt its popularity subjectively. And in that subversive mind frame that the truth movement has been emotionally attached to, combined with being ignorant of the Middle East and real foreign policy, they are afraid of falling under a spell of pro-war propaganda, along with being disillusioned by their fantastical expectations that they have been long misled into believing are the ulterior conspirators behind 9/11, and not bothering to investigate the validity of Al-Qaeda or Islamic terrorism as a shift or trend throughout the Arab and Third World. A prime example ignored, ending the 90s era, is the Millennium Plot, as in what almost occurred during the 2000 New Year's Y2K celebrations, not just up into the Canadian border with Ahmed Rassam and those linked to him in New York City and elsewhere in the US, but also other Millennium incidents that did actually take place in South Asia and the Middle East then, and since then post 9/11, into now what's further escalated with 3 administrations later continuing the unending mess with the war on terror. And what about the 1980s? Was there ever an earlier warning sign of attacking the World Trade Center back then? What was the US's approach on dealing with international terrorism? Was there ever a call for the war on terrorism then, such as the failed war on drugs? How about Europe back then? Where did Islamic terrorism exist? Was there another underground network like Al-Qaeda that predates it? Why did the 1986 West Berlin discotheque bombing happen? Was Libya really responsible? How was ISIS able to manifest in Libya a decade after 9/11 while there had been an ongoing coalition with the war on terrorism? Who was Abu al-Zarqawi? And how did he just all of a sudden appear in Iraq, ultimately becoming another pretext for the 2003 US invasion? And why also did he behead Nick Berg? Why did Osama bin Laden really move to Sudan in 1992? Who is Gulbuddin Hekmatyar? And why did he become one of the first suspects for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing? And why isn't there any effort to capturing Ayman al-Zawahiri, who still roams free?
Work hard, Marty! Who? Who do you think? The Libyans!
Isn't there something to be said about how just within less than 15 years, The U.S. went from Muammar Gaddafi as Arab villain, then on to Saddam Hussein as Arab villain, and then on to Osama bin Laden. But then back to Saddam, and then back to Gaddafi? Especially when Libya issued the first arrest warrant through Interpol against bin Laden on March 16, 1998, naming him as the main suspect in the murder of 2 German citizens in Libya in 1994. This all before the U.S. issued their bin Laden arrest warrant months later for conspiracy to attack defense utilities of the United States. And what about the 70s? Who the hell was Carlos the Jackal? What was the Black September? What ultimately was the consequence of Munich in 1972? Why does this kind of activity go back to Germany so much? These historical questions, not only pertaining to the pre- and post-bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, do have somewhat useful information, but they have not been thoroughly challenged within the mainstream alternative conspiracy theories or within established 9/11 truth movements when scrutinized over its popular inside job claims, in sequential contrast to 9/11 itself, when the attacks were certainly carried out on the surface definitively by a loose association of Arabs and or individuals who identify as Muslims within a conventional Al-Qaeda nexus. And even given positions of deniability by feds doesn't make it a default reason to grant collusion accusation or suggest government conspiracies and or domestic complicity, but instead can also be more to do with neglect and compartment conflicts, as well as covering up their own mistakes. But none of these obstructions, given along with real anomalies still showing cover-ups, detracts that these crimes were not carried out by an ulterior international conspiracy. In other words, what Alex Jones has proclaimed for decades, misguided by those discredited sources that even predate him, in that the 1993 World Trade Center bombing was an inside job, or in his definition of a false flag, is utter nonsense. Regardless of patriotic rhetoric and local sentiment, retroactively when looking back at younger Alex Jones, given his Christian compromise and disposition of being a college dropout, to him, in what seemed a sincere proclamation at the time to implicate a shadow government in what also occurred 2 years later after the 1993 bombing with the Oklahoma City bombing, in contrast to the overview on what we've uncovered with 1993, Alex Jones is not interested in correcting any of these false narratives he has promoted for nearly 2 decades, even when it comes to the most controversial implication involvements of all, the celebratory incident with the high-fiving dancing Israelis of 9/11, which is a widely accepted claim now by the truth movement, while Jones continues to marginalize and outright omit it.
I've got so many questions, but you are vindicated. This has got to be the 50th time the last 6 months on the radical Muslims celebrating, not just in New Jersey, but New York.
Discrediting 9/11 truth further than what damage he already done as a founder, ascribing to and promoting the hoax claim that a missile hit the Pentagon by way of non-credentialed skeptics. The kind of sloppy research that's gotten him in the mess he's in now with the Sandy Hook lawsuits against him. That's why in regarding his vicinity in 1995, Jones's conclusion and his first-hand research and publications on OKC should be equally re-examined and scrutinized just as they should for 9/11, since clearly he's gotten it wrong from the beginning with 1993. And it's prevalent now with the legal troubles he's gotten himself into, becoming more than just a loss of credibility and finance with these lawsuits against him over the Sandy Hook hoax he instigated. But what's also in jeopardy is his own mechanism to continue to perpetuate modern urban myths as a means to keep his operation afloat, with Sandy Hook being the catalyst of getting himself deplatformed on all the major social and multimedia sites. And now, with the public release of the deposition regarding those Sandy Hook lawsuits, has become very revealing of Jones, past and present.
The truth is, Mr. Jones, you were the first person in the world to make the false flag theory about Sandy Hook, and you did it before the bodies were even cold. That's the truth.
Or whether it's babies having their brains bashed out in incubators or WMDs, that I upfront questioned it because things from Operation Northwoods. Well, I mean, we always covered things from a perspective of caution. We were covering other people's reports and also questioning the historical fact that things like Operation Northwoods, a government plan to stage mass shootings in the U.S. Kennedy said no to the plan, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs had green-lighted it. And so because of things like that, we are forced to then question these events. And I think that's, it's just part of the process in this country.
Notice how Jones uses Operation Northwoods as his get-out-of-jail card, or more like confirmation bias card, wielding this conventional declassified 1962 plan, which was never close to manifesting, as his excuse as to why he instigated Sandy Hook hoax theories, when anyone who's classically followed 9/11 truth knows that Operation Northwoods is definitively Jones's original talking point to defend his past outlandish claims on who and how 9/11 was carried out. Such an accusation is both illogical and unusual given his age and position of being an independent media source, given the resources and opportunity to analyze basic history and recent news, when such a notion that 9/11 was an Operation Northwoods type event is laughable, when there's the crimes of Ramzi Yousef past the 1993 bombing, regardless of what insidious planners in the government of yesteryear were in position, or how sensational of a plan it sounded. All the history that surrounds 9/11, in addition to having previously aided the Mujahideen, gives no rhyme, no reason to disrupt the blatant pattern to specific urban international terrorism, equated as a government conspiracy by default, when there's simply the Bojinka plot. And with drafting up Operation Northwoods, which is primarily in maritime terms a foreign attack to invoke a similar response to an earlier false flag attack in Cuba. Remember the USS Maine? When considering not only innovation, but that a small part of the plan was using one drone aircraft meant to look like a passenger plane, as well as other fighter planes. And even though there is a reference to hijacking, the ultimate goal was mainly to make it appear that the passenger plane was shot down, by even blowing it up as an option. But none of it has to do with the actual terms of hijacking the plane from within inside the craft, by Cuban terrorists or even kamikaze, but in an attempt to provoking or seizing the aircraft, basically intercepting it with mock Cuban warplanes, as detailed within the documents about making the appearance that the passenger plane with American college students would be harassed by other duplicate aircraft painted to look like Cuban MiGs, added with transmitting a Mayday message stating that they were under attack, confusing as it might sound. When looking at things conventionally and the time of innovation, it's not hard to figure out if you do some basic research on the history of hijackings, when in actuality before they were called hijackings, they were called skyjackings, and were all either cases of robbery or criminals seeking to escape or political asylum, which in 1962, when Northwoods was drafted up, hijackings was a relatively recent phenomenon and rarely happened particularly in the manners of terrorism by attempting or threatening to destroy the aircraft, which in fact, in technical terms, the first terrorist hijacking with the intent to destroy an airliner and all its passengers was carried out in the same provocation intent like Northwoods, but by Israeli warplanes 8 years before, in 1954, under the orders of General Moshe Dayan, where the IDF intercepted and seized a Syrian airliner, forcing it to land, holding everyone inside as hostages in exchange to get Israeli prisoners freed from Damascus. And if that seems outdated or not strikingly similar enough to 9/11, then consider the consequence of those actions carried out by IDF and its foundation, when ironically, just 8 years later in September of 1970, there's the Dawson's Field hijackings, where 4 out of 5 planes are successfully hijacked by the Black September and landed in Jordan, where luckily no passengers were killed, but the planes were blown up by explosives. And yet, somehow, Alex Jones became the historian on terrorism and false flags, the authority of 9/11 Truth?
Sandy Hook, before I was ever sued, lost money. 9/11 Truth lost me almost all my radio stations and lost money. Those type of really controversial stands, people don't like them, and they have crippled us before these lawsuits.
That rationale is simply laughable. Jones couldn't have lost money over 9/11 Truth when he had gone beyond Bush's 2 terms promoting it, producing several films, pressing books, t-shirts, and other merchandise marketed with 9/11 in the title. It is practically the crisis, along with the advent of social media, that eventually springboarded his network into major recognition. If Alex Jones lost so much money, then why did he go even further, co-opting the most popular of 9/11 Truth films and produces a third and contemporary version of Loose Change, which again has all been the base of his own fear cult doctrine, that he and his loyal believers still to this day equate 9/11 to Operation Northwoods. Alex Jones is nothing but an incompetent liar, and he disturbingly has the largest audience in alternative media. And because of that, combined with his ego, he is the victim of his own narratives that has projected a tremendous mistrust in American society today and throughout other dissidents globally.
So you have to look at the agenda behind things. You have to balance things about why has the mainstream media lied so much, why have governments lied so much, the fact that the public doesn't believe what they're told anymore. And it really is the fact that we've allowed the government and institutions to become so corrupt that people lost any compass of what's real. And I myself have, almost had like a form of psychosis. I genuinely questioned, and I think the government and media that's been caught lying so much has created an atmosphere where people don't know what's true.
So you do not believe that you've done an outrageous wrong to these parents?
I've not done an outrageous wrong to the parents.
If you can be that callous and clumsy with real victims' family members, imagine how he truly sees those survivors, victims' families, and those who still want accountability for 9/11. And it shows now just by his choice of social priorities, when even in the most recent 9/11 anniversary, a 9/11 every other day, total daily abortions near death toll of September 11th. Where have we heard that one before? Can you say Christian cult? But that was the theme of the Alex Jones show, where he declared abortion as America's greatest sin, where Jones has conveniently forgotten that Americans' real sin has been its military-industrial complex and dastardly foreign policy, particularly towards third world countries, that resulted in the 9/11 attacks, regardless of foreign or domestic intelligent ties and provocations, as its greater sin was covering up and using the deaths of nearly 3,000 people killed in broad daylight to only sustain the same problem that got us here in the first place, and will only happen again, which already makes the future look bleak and no safer or closer to any resolve than we were before. And if one may be led to believe or conclude that this is just merely an act, that Jones has been a government disinformation agent or asset all along, well, if you use Jones's own diagnosis and just listen to what comes out of his mouth, you would have every right to make such an accusation, unfounded or not, just as what Adam Green of No More News has recently pointed out.
And I just got text from top intelligence in Israel. Israel has nominated Donald Trump for the 2017 Peace Prize. And Israel has decided to make this nomination basically on the decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, taking, I think, an historic, maybe even biblical step to legitimate the state of Israel.
Well, certainly providence that he invoked during the inaugural speech is with our republic. And, of course, England began to help the Jews when they were being persecuted going back 1,000 years ago in Europe. And, of course, it's been known since then. That's why England had so much great providence. And also, of course, the Christian faith and Christ being number one.
Yes, well, even while we're talking, I mean, Israel, I just got another text message. I said we were going to break the news on Alex Jones' InfoWars broadcast. They said one word. They said, great. They're thrilled we're going to break the news on Alex Jones' InfoWars. And that comes directly from a source who's really above Mossad and the intelligence structure in Israel.
Yeah, so folks are really getting things raw here on air now. Folks are really getting things raw here on air now.
How did you get Donald Trump on your show prior to the election? How did you pull that off?
All right, I never tell this on my own show, and this will probably end up being news tomorrow, but you deserve it. I know folks that are part of Delta Force, and I know people that are part of covert action in the Defense Department and the CIA. And quite frankly, they've given me authorization to talk about this. I have never been in the CIA. I have never been part of covert operations, but I was basically contacted by groups inside the Special Forces operations in Florida, inside breakaway groups inside the Central Intelligence Agency, and groups basically behind American industry that wanted to defeat the globalists and they're planning to bankrupt America.
But this is what got Donald Trump to say, I got to be on this guy's show?
Donald Trump was advised by the Special Forces Command out of Florida. They said
to go on your program.
I mean, that's who actually, let's just say it, the enemy already knows all this. Let me just say this so everybody listening knows I'm telling the truth. Special Operations Command in Florida, the Delta Force, Army, Black Ops, Army's the oldest thing in America. It's before the Constitution, anything. They said, sir, you need to go with Alex Jones, and you need to rally the troops. And they briefed him. They showed him the documents, and they said, we need you to run. And the Delta Force basically asked Trump. Delta Force, founded by General Boykin and Schumacher and people like Dr. C. Pachenik of Psychological Operations of the CIA.
That's exactly what all our sources from the FBI and the Pentagon, which means the CIA connected Pentagon, that's Special Operations, that's what they told us. And these are the good guys that continue to give us good info. It doesn't mean the whole thing's good. InfoWars is the tip of the spear, the tip of the spear, the tip of the spear. Oh, Alex Jones is wrong about Anthony Bourdain. Hey, Joe, I talked to the people that were there in the production at the highest levels. They're involved in the Pentagon, everything else. I know all about it. Elon Musk. I mean, Joe, I'm not going to tell you, who I talked to yesterday or who I talked to this afternoon. So just let's quit pretending that we aren't the tip of the spear. Let's quit pretending that we aren't the tip of the spear.
The tip of the spear. The tip of the spear.
The tip of the spear. The tip of the spear. But even after I've tried to be nice to 4chan and 8chan and the whole Q thing, it comes out and says, Jones is a Zionist shill. He's going to get arrested. All this crap. Trump's daughter is married to an Orthodox Jew. Trump is pro-Israel, but you guys don't attack him because he's too big a target. But see that paradox of Q becoming anti-Semitic? That's not the real Q. If Q was ever real, we don't need a bunch of anti-Semitic crap, a bunch of anti-Israel stuff. That's a diversion. The Chi-Coms are the issue. The EU's the issue. The UN collapsing our borders the issue. But the idea that QAnon is attacking me constantly, going, he's an Israeli shill, don't listen to him. Or maybe it's not even government agents at QAnon, they're Democrats. Maybe they're just people that think there's a set market of conspiracy. Set market of conspiracy. Set market of conspiracy. And I think some of the lower IQ people out there just want something simple they can believe in to go along with it.
But in all seriousness, regardless of administrations, government, and media structures past and present, what we have demonstrated about 1993 should be thoroughly grasped by whatever claims itself to be the 9/11 truth movement, in order to make a case stronger in 9/11 and to also help bring reasonable expectations on uncovering who and what is thoroughly responsible for all these inseparable attacks, in contrast to what authorities have narrowed down to the public as masterminds. The bottom line is that whoever has been organizing these attacks are willingly doing so to set up a false pretext to implicate Iraq, and that it spans many years before even the slightest suggestion of think tank planning with the neoconservative Project for a New American Century. And for the sake of entertaining a Zionist conspiracy or conspirators, the Odin Yanon plan of Greater Israel was already out there in 1982. But as we're coming to a closure, one question that hasn't been answered is how did Ramzi Yousef and other conspirators know where to park the explosive Ryder van in the closest spot near the center of the North Tower? Wouldn't logic tell you that you would either have to have blueprints or a map?
Ronald Bucha was a New York City fire marshal, a 22-year veteran of the department who also served in the U.S. Army as a Green Beret during Vietnam. In 1986, he became a reservist joining the Fire Department of New York in Rescue 1, one of the oldest rescue companies in all of New York. And he survived a spectacular fall in that same year, falling through 5 floors while attempting to rescue a lieutenant who was trapped on the 4th floor of the tenement. Bucha was not expected to live and could have retired on a $250,000 tax-free pension at the age of 32. But he vowed to return to the FDNY and Rescue 1, in which he did a year later. Ronnie Bucha became a legend throughout the FDNY and was adequately nicknamed the Flying Fireman. But because he was doing paratrooper training as a reservist, he switched positions due to his injured back by working as a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst. After responding to the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, Ronnie had a personal interest in investigating the matter due to the incident involving longtime friend and fellow firefighter Kevin Shea, who had fallen 4 stories into the impact hole left by the urea nitrate bomb, which was placed in the Ryder truck, in which Shea inspected himself. The incident with Kevin Shea was dramatized and also played by George Clooney in the 1993 made-for-TV movie Without Warning, Terror in the Towers, which was aired on NBC. The FBI had shut out the local fire department investigators who could have contributed to the federal investigation. So Ronnie then educated himself about Middle East and Islamic terrorism and began his own personal probe. He would document thousands of files himself. He told dozens of people over the years that he was convinced that there was going to be another attack on the World Trade Center once again. In September of 1999, for 9 months, Ronnie was working at Metrotech, one of the more modern secure buildings which contained plans for virtually all of the major building structures in New York City, and was also one of the new fire department headquarters in Brooklyn. One day in his cubicle doing some paperwork, Bucha overheard 2 fire marshals talking about an incident that occurred just a few days earlier, where an accountant claimed to have lost his ID on a PATH train to New Jersey, but that there was something suspiciously wrong. According to the general rule working in the building, if you lost your ID, you had to tell fire marshals immediately, in which they did affirm that when they spoke to this accountant and asked if he filed a lost access card report, the accountant said he did. But when the same 2 fire marshals came in the next morning and found the report card filled out, not only was there something wrong with the timing of the report, but it was also signed by the name of a fire marshal who was also on vacation at the time of the signature. As one would obviously conclude, It must have been forged. But by whom? While the fire marshals were explaining the situation to Ronnie, they said the accountant was Egyptian. Ronnie became so compelled to act on his suspicions and wanted to know more about this accountant and why they would go through so much trouble to get a new ID. That accountant's name was Ahmed Amin Rafai, who was a naturalized Egyptian citizen and an FDY accountant for 25 years. On a hunch, Ronnie started taking a closer look at Rafai and went down to observe videotape taken of Rafai, which clearly showed that his reportedly lost ID card was actually in his back pocket when he was requesting a new one, and that later the security video showed him swiping his ID card through the reader and entering Metrotech. Rafai was interviewed later, but gave conflicting information to the supervisor. His ultimate answer for getting a new ID card was for, quote, nostalgic reasons. Ronnie wondered why an experienced, long-standing accountant would risk his entire career and reputation for simply lying over a lost card. Nostalgic reasons? Or something more? Buka continued to press forward as to why the risks Rafai took. Ronnie ended up commiserating with his boss, who was also Rafai's supervisor, Kay Woods, who is now Deputy Assistant Commissioner. He asked her what kind of an employee Rafai had been. Woods in return rolled her eyes and said, this guy was like a ghost employee. He would come in late, took every vacation, would fall asleep at his desk, and make calls to his native home of Egypt. He was like a non-entity in the department. Ronnie then asked Woods if Rafai had ever done anything else unusual that she observed. Woods said that in the early 1990s, prior to the first World Trade Center bombing, while the capital budget unit was being renovated, where she and Rafai were located previously, that there was a time that Rafai got in hold of blueprints to the World Trade Center. A large number of blueprints to New York City, more notable buildings, were kept in the inspection department located inside the filing cabinets that were thrown out into two large dumpsters. When one day, Kay was at lunch and came back to finding Rafai digging through the dumpsters and found the World Trade Center blueprints on his desk. Woods specifically remembered Rafai asking about the blueprints. Can I have these? At the time, she thought nothing of it. The day of the first World Trade Center bombing, Rafai called in sick. He then became extremely paranoid. Woods described a pattern where he told her that he thought the FBI was bugging his garage. After listening to Woods' experiences with Rafai, Buka was aghast. It confirmed his initial suspicions about why Rafai was acting so irresponsible regarding the ID pass. Ronnie went to a local news channel where he knew a film editor he then asked to view some news archives, and after looking at the 4th or 5th videotape, he found one showing Rafai on the arm of the notorious Egyptian radical Islamic militant Omar Abdel Rahman, the Blind Sheikh. He was acting as his bodyguard, moving him through the crowd while whispering in his ear. Rafai, seen here with one of the most notorious radical fundamentalists in the world, Buka was left astonished. Ronnie then discovered that the FBI had interviewed him twice in 1994. But more specifically, Ronnie found out from people in the fire department that Rafai had been seen in the new footage walking near the Blind Sheikh holding his arm. Given his knowledge of the Egyptians and the role that they played early with the Blind Sheikh and the New York landmarks plot and the first World Trade Center bombing, Buka was convinced he was an Al-Qaeda operative. Ronnie rushes this information of Rafai obtaining plans at the World Trade Center and brings it to the FBI field headquarters in New York in September of 1999. Agents at the New York field office refused to listen to his observations. One of the agents even told Buka, well, we don't see any crime here. There is nothing we could do. Buka was absolutely stunned at the refusal to even take his account seriously. But that didn't stop Ronnie, as he had access to information the public did not, and he intensely investigated more and kept a bird's eye on the Twin Tower. 1 month before the 9/11 attacks, he visited one of the security guards at the World Trade Center and inquired whether there were any new means of egress that could allow anyone to the World Trade Center from below. On Tuesday morning, September 11, 2001, after American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., Ronnie roared down lights and sirens to Liberty Street alongside his partner, Fire Marshal Jimmy Devery. They parked, donned their turnout coats, and made their way in the backstairs of the South Tower, where United Airlines 175 had just struck. Ronnie actually reached the impact zone of the 78th floor of the South Tower, along with Battalion Chief Oriel Palmer, who devised a plan to put out the fire. The two men were the only firefighters who made it that far, as both were experienced marathon runners.
Okay, 7, 9, 4, 1, 5. We got 2 isolated pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. Where you know that? 78th floor, number 1045, call 1.
1045 Code 1s means dead bodies.
Chief, what state are you in? South Sterling, Adam, South Tower. 478. South 4 over here. Numerous civilians, we have two engines up here. Alright, South 4, we're on our way.
At the impact zone, up on the 78th floor, Chief Oreo Palmer and Fire Marshal Ronald Bucca stay to fight the blaze among the dead and the dying. Palmer again tries to reach members of Ladder Company 15.
Battalion 7, Ladder 15.
It is the last time anyone hears from either Chief Palmer or Fire Marshal Bucca.
But as the flames roared around them, the steel buckled, which led to an eventual collapse. Both men perished as the tower crumbled down straight to the bottom. Ronnie Bucca was the only firefighter marshal in the history of the New York City Fire Department to be killed in the line of duty. Fire Marshal Devery, who was with Bucca earlier, had rescued a badly burned woman named Ling Young on the 51st floor and got her to safety. Both survived. Author Peter Lance extensively documents the story of Ronnie Bucca and his discovery of Ahmed Rafai in his first self-authored investigative trilogy of 9/11, 1,000 Years for Revenge, International Terrorism, the FBI, The Untold Story. Lance was able to get detailed and personal information from Bucca's wife and those close to him, and decided to continue investigating his angle by confronting Rafai. Veteran FBI agents Joe O'Brien, with his partner organized crime expert Andy Currens, went with Peter Lance to interview Rafai for his first book, and wanted to give him an opportunity to respond to what he was told. Rafai admitted that he did act as Sheikh's translator at his INS hearing. He admitted that he was a member of the Masjid al-Salam Mosque in Jersey City, and that he frequented the other two mosques in Brooklyn where the Sheikh used to preach. During the 45-minute interview, Lance asked Rafai 4 times if he would renounce the blind Sheikh, in which each time he refused to renounce him. Lance showed him a video still of him next to the blind Sheikh, and Rafai admitted that that was him, but he denied that he obtained the plans to the World Trade Center, or that he had called in sick on the day of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Rafai stated that he was just a member of the mosque, that he was walking the Sheikh to an immigration hearing as his translator. Lance then pressed and asked him, "Well, did you know Mahmoud Abalima?" To which Rafai replied, "Yes, I know him." "Did you know Mohammed Salameh?" "Yes, I know him." "Did you know Nidal Ayad?" "Yes, I knew him." "Did you know El Said Nosser?" "Yes, I knew him. But I do not really know these men. In other words, I was only acquainted with them." At the very end of the interview, Lance asked him at one point, "How did you feel about 9/11? Rafai paused, tried to fake a weepy-eyed kind of expression, and said, "I went to the park in the town, and I hold a candle for these people." Lance also opined, "He started to get like he was remorseful, but not for long. I really pressed this guy hard." Rafai had a subtle change into his sudden emotion, but not for long, according to Lance, as he kept pressing on Rafai about his relationship with the blind Sheikh, in which, after a few minutes, Rafai had finally lost it, and said, "Do you know why the FBI did not discover 9/11? Lance couldn't comprehend, but he responded to Rafai saying, "Well, that's what my book seeks to answer," to which Rafai replied, "No. Do you understand what my people believe? This is not bin Laden. This is not the Sheikh. This is the United States government doing this for Israel." Lance looked over at the other surprised FBI agents, and they were all aghast at Rafai's statement. Lance had replied, "Let me get this straight. You are saying that your people believe that the 3,000 people were murdered by the United States government on behalf of the State of Israel?" Rafai made final proclamation. "Yes, this is what my people believe." Lance just thought it was absurd, which resulted the end of the interview with Lance and the FBI agents leaving the house.
Of course, Rafai must have been seizing upon all the wild conspiracy theories that were also afloat in the Middle East at the time. However, even with what Rafai may have known or not, doesn't absolve any of the Mossad apparatus that's been uncovered on the Jersey side at the bare minimal. Particularly when there's also the case of the 5 Middle Eastern suspects linked to Danko Mechanical and Magic Heating and Air, having prior and unauthorized access to the Twin Towers just days before September 11th, and were arrested months later in Tennessee on a sting for fraudulent IDs, which was subsequent to the FBI's 9/11 dragnet. That case in Tennessee should make one reconsider the Port Authority more as suspect or needed inquiry rather than just leaseholders of the World Trade Center complex, which is not necessary for implication in 9/11, as most are compelled to imply Larry Silverstein in their conspiracy conclusion, which in retrospect, Silverstein didn't own the World Trade Center in 1993 and neither in 1999, just before the Millennium Plot. But the bottom line here is that it would be gross negligence to ignore Peter Lance's story on Ronnie Bucca, regardless if his total conclusion blames the Al-Qaeda network, because his pursuit to connect both 1993 World Trade Center bombing to 9/11 through Ramzi Yousef and the Bojinka plot is certainly one angle that this presentation has relied on. And similarly, like with the International Herald Tribune questioning the role of Josie Hadass, FBI spokesman Joe Valquit had put down Lance's story of Rafai infiltrating the New York Fire Department after his first book, 1,000 Years of Revenge, was released, saying that it's rehash of old stories, gossip, and speculation. And if you think the anthrax letters right after the 9/11 attacks is simply your instant inside job proof of no foreign involvement, you might want to reconsider when it's a fact that it was also reported that anthrax was missing from the same U.S. Army Medical Research Institute laboratory in Fort Detrick, Maryland, right around the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. And not only was there controversy going on there 2 years before in 1991, where Dr. Ayad Assad, an Egyptian, had filed a formal complaint against co-workers Drs. Philip Zach and Marion Rippey for racial harassment, in which subsequently led them leaving U.S. AMRID in 1992. Assad stayed on until March of 1997, where then budget cuts led Assad to being laid off, for which he then sued the U.S. Army for age and ethnic discrimination. After 9/11 in October of 2001, the FBI called Assad in for questioning. It was also revealed that the FBI had received an anonymous letter, postmarked September 21, 2001, in which an alleged co-worker warned that Assad might be planning a biological attack. The letter was unsigned and computer-typed. It stated, in part, that Dr. Assad is a potential biological terrorist. I have worked with Dr. Assad and I heard him say that he has a vendetta against the U.S. government. Although in his defense it was concluded that the letter was written by a female in which Marion Rippey was suspected to have written it, the FBI cleared Assad of these allegations and determined they were unfounded. But when it came to implicating Bruce Ivins for the anthrax attacks years later, Assad also said in an interview to the Washington Post in 2008 that not only did he know Ivins, but made the accusation that Bruce Ivins was a victim of a vicious plot. But that's it. We've come to an end. We hope that this expanded film inspires not just other researchers, but those who want to take action and initiatives that need to be applied still, for accountability and to remedy these problems and enforce prevention. I may not have all the answers or solutions, but at least I do have other perspectives balanced with official and unofficial evidence and missing links that are essential to understanding what else may have been in part responsible for these terrorist attacks committed in the 90s and on to 9/11, along with possibly getting a better understanding of how we've gotten into this mess, which could have been prevented, and are worthy inquiries to these historical narratives that have had profound social and geopolitical impact. But as a storyteller for now, I also need your support. Please consider donating through PayPal. Your help will help me in acquiring costly unreleased archives from news networks to produce more film series, especially due to the fact that YouTube has practically removed all monetizing features for conspiracy theory and historical skeptics content. And your contributions could also help me in compiling all this information and much more into writing a potential book. Also, if you want to get an early preview on my next films and help financially, then please consider becoming a Patreon to also get special updates and other original content pertaining to 9/11. Perhaps we can spark more than just filmmaking, but a renaissance in the 9/11 truth movement and finally get some progress and sensible closure. Thank you for watching this film, and please subscribe to my channels. And remember, 9/11 is an open investigation, if you want it to be. Please view the complete source material of documentaries and literature that we reference in this film. Check out all 3 of Peter Lance's widely available books on 9/11. For extensive research on Ramzi Yousef, check out The New Jackals by Simon Reeve. For research on Zacarias Moussaoui and the Oklahoma City bombing, read Mitchell Gray's I Heard You Were Going on Jihad. And for more controversial research with the 1993 World Trade Center and Oklahoma City bombings, as well as 9/11, do read Michael Collins Piper's books, The Judas Goats and False Flags, Template for Terror.